into darkness. Hook. Imagine waking up in a world where the shadows are alive, where you're not alone, but something far worse is waiting for you in the dark. What if escaping was never an option? Dive into this terrifying journey and discover the chilling truth that sometimes there's no way out. Keep watching, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything. The room was cold. Too cold. Dark shadows stretched across the walls. A single light bulb flickered above, barely illuminating the space. The ticking of an old clock echoed in the silence. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the only sound, and it seemed too loud. He sat on the edge of the bed. His hands were trembling. His breath came out in quick, shallow bursts. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in. It felt suffocating. The window was closed, but the air still smelled stale. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right. He tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to him. A low hum filled the room, like an electric buzz, just under the surface. He glanced at the door. It was slightly ajar. Had it always been? He couldn't remember. He stood, moving toward it. Each step felt heavy. The floor creaked beneath him, loud in the quiet. The door opened with a slow groan. Beyond it was pitch black. No sound, no movement. But he could feel it. The weight of eyes watching him from the dark. He stepped into the hallway. It felt colder here. The air was thick. Too thick. His heart pounded in his chest. His breath came faster now. He turned, but saw nothing. Nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the stairs ahead. He started walking, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the heavy air. The staircase creaked under his feet. The darkness seemed to swirl around him. Closer now. He reached the bottom and froze. A figure, a silhouette standing at the far end of the room, still unmoving. Watching him, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His mouth was dry. The figure did not speak, did not move, just watched. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room. The figure was gone. He looked around, heart racing. The door. It slammed shut behind him. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the room. It was deafening. His pulse thundered in his ears. He turned back, but the hallway was empty. No figure, no movement, just the silence. He reached for the doorknob, his fingers trembling. It wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, but it was locked. The room felt smaller now. The air was thick, suffocating. He took a step back, his eyes darting around, searching. Nothing. Everything was still, but then a whisper, a faint sound, barely audible. It came from behind him. He spun around. Nothing. The darkness was impenetrable, but the whisper lingered. It grew louder, closer. A voice. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't dare move. The voice was familiar. It was his name. A cold chill ran down his spine. The walls seemed to close in. The light flickered again, dimming. His shadow stretched unnaturally long. He could feel something behind him. The air shifted, heavy with presence. Without thinking, he turned, his body moving on its own. There, in the corner of the room, a pair of eyes glowed in the darkness, unblinking, staring at him. His mouth went dry. He couldn't breathe. His heart raced, every beat louder than the last. The eyes moved, slowly, deliberately. They seemed to be closing in. The floor beneath him creaked again. A shadow stretched forward, fast, too fast. He took a step back. His foot hit something soft, a body. He gasped and spun around. There, sprawled on the floor, was someone he knew, someone he loved, their eyes wide open, unseeing, cold. The room tilted. His vision blurred. He reached down, shaking, trembling. But before he could touch the body, a hand grabbed his wrist. Cold. Dead cold. He froze. A whisper in his ear, just above a breath. "You're next." The grip on his wrist tightened. Ice cold. A shock ran through his entire body. His heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't pull away. He couldn't move. The voice, just a whisper. Next. It sent a wave of terror through him. The darkness seemed to press closer, like something was suffocating the very air. He looked down. The hand that held him was pale. Too pale. The skin was thin, stretched tight over bone. The fingers were twisted, unnatural. With a surge of adrenaline, he yanked his arm free, but his wrist was bruised. The cold lingered on his skin. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping. His breath came in ragged gasps. Then the floor beneath him groaned. Louder now. The walls creaked. The house seemed to be alive, shaking, breathing. He could feel it. He turned, desperate to get out. But the door was still locked. He had to find another way, had to leave. His hands scrambled over the walls. The darkness was everywhere. There was no escape. Suddenly, the light bulb above him flickered one last time, and then it went out completely. He was plunged into total darkness. He froze. Not a sound. Just silence. Then footsteps. Slow. Measured. They came from behind him. He could feel them getting closer. Closer. Each step echoed in his skull. Without thinking, he spun around. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. But the air had changed. It was colder. Tighter. Like something was circling him. Something he couldn't see. He took a step forward. The floor beneath him cracked. A loud snap. And then a sudden pain shot up his leg. He cried out, but no sound came. His vision blurred. Everything spun. The ground shifted beneath him. He fell, his hands reaching out to steady himself. But there was nothing there. He hit the floor hard. The cold seeped into his bones. The room seemed to be collapsing around him. Then he saw it. A shadow. A figure in the corner. It wasn't moving. It was just watching. A low hum filled the room again. It was the same whisper. The same words. You're next. And then the darkness swallowed him whole. The silence was suffocating. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The darkness was thick like tar. It pressed against his chest. He tried to open his mouth, but no sound came out. His limbs were frozen, like the world had stopped around him. The shadow in the corner, it moved, slowly. Its form stretched, elongated. It was no longer just a figure. It was something else, something darker. It crawled, inch by inch, toward him. Closer, closer. His heart hammered. Panic surged through him. The air was freezing now. Each breath burned. He couldn't look away. The shadow was right in front of him. He felt its presence. It's cold. It was like the room was filled with ice. Then a voice, low, whispering, "You didn't believe, did you?" The words slithered into his mind, chilled him to the core. It was the same voice, the one from before. He tried to move, to scream, but his body wouldn't obey. Skeletal. It brushed against his cheek. So cold, he could feel it deep inside him. The room was spinning. His vision blurred. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating. A breath, a sharp, ragged breath. It was his own, but it didn't sound right. His chest felt tight. "You're next," it whispered again. The hand moved lower, toward his neck. It lingered, cold, unyielding. He felt the pressure. Tighter, tighter, like something was squeezing the air from his lungs. Desperation flooded him. A surge of adrenaline. He fought with every ounce of strength left in him. His hands moved, trembling, but nothing could break the hold. The darkness was closing in, and then a sudden jolt. The light flickered back on. The room snapped into focus. But everything was different. The shadow was gone. The air was still, and the body on the floor was gone too. The room was eerily silent now. The air felt too still, too calm. His breath came in shallow gasps. His body shook, but he didn't know why. Had it been a dream? Had he imagined it all? He staggered to his feet, his legs weak beneath him. The light above him hummed softly. He looked around. The walls, the floor, the bed. Everything was in place. Nothing had changed, except the door. It was wide open now. He hadn't opened it. He was sure of it. But there it was, an invitation into the hallway beyond. He hesitated. A part of him screamed to run, to escape. But the other part, the part that couldn't ignore the pull, stepped forward. Slowly, tentatively, he moved toward the door, his footsteps muffled on the carpet. His eyes flicked from side to side, searching for something, anything. But the hallway was empty. No shadow, no figure. He swallowed hard. The air felt wrong. Cold, heavy. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was something else. A strange pressure in the air, like the walls were closing in again. He took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath him. The sound seemed to echo, louder than it should have been. His eyes scanned the hallway, but there was nothing. Just darkness. The darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then a sound, a soft rustling from behind him. He spun around. Nothing. No one. The door to the room was still wide open. But now, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was him, but not him. The figure's eyes gleamed, empty, hollow. They locked onto his. Cold. A slow, twisted smile spread across the figure's face. It opened its mouth, and the whisper came again. "You're next." The words reverberated through his mind, searing into his thoughts. He couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, and the floor groaned again, this time beneath his feet. The air thickened. The walls pressed closer, and the darkness. It took him, the world around him twisted. The darkness closed in, suffocating. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see. The figure in front of him was no longer just a shape. It was something far worse. Something made of shadows, of endless, empty voids. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. His hands reached out, but they felt nothing. Only air, thick and heavy. The floor beneath him cracked. The walls trembled. He could feel them, closer, tighter. Then, a flash of light, brief, blinding. When his eyes opened again, he was no longer in the hallway. He was standing in a room. The room was familiar, but wrong, twisted. The bed was in the corner. The walls, the door, everything was the same, but they were somehow distorted. And the figure was gone. But the air was colder than ever. He looked down at his hands. His fingers trembled, but they looked different. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His nails were longer. He looked around again, and the room seemed to shift before his eyes, like it was alive, like it was breathing. The light above him flickered. A low hum filled the room, the hum from before, the one that never seemed to stop. And then a voice. This time it was clear, loud, and unmistakable. "Welcome home." It was the same voice, the voice that had whispered before. It was close, too close. He spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one there. But the voice, it lingered, and then he saw it. In the corner of his vision, a shadow, sliding along the walls. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a shape, a figure, its eyes gleaming with that same cold, unfeeling stare. And it spoke again, slow, deliberate. "You're next." He reached out, his hand shaking, but the figure was already gone, vanishing into the darkness. The room seemed to shrink around him. The walls pressed in tighter. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and then everything went black. The blackness was complete. utterly silent. No light, no sound. Just an emptiness that swallowed everything whole. He couldn't feel his body. Couldn't tell if he was standing, lying down, or floating. It was as if time had stopped. Or maybe time didn't even exist anymore. And then a flicker, a spark. The dim glow of a light bulb, flickering weakly in the distance. He tried to move toward it, but his feet felt heavy, as if they were dragging through thick mud. Each step felt like an eternity. Closer, closer. The light grew stronger, blinding, and then he was there, standing in front of it. The room was familiar, the same room from before, the same bed, the same door, the same walls. But something was different now. It was colder. The air was thick with something unseen, something suffocating. He turned around, and there, in the corner, was the figure again. Not just any figure. It was him, standing motionless, its eyes glowing with that same icy light. A chill ran through him. He wanted to run, but his legs were rooted to the floor. Frozen, the figure took a slow step forward, the air crackling with an unnatural energy. It wasn't just looking at him anymore. It was studying him, as if analyzing every detail of his being. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat was tight, as if something was pressing down on it. The figure raised its hand, slowly, and with that motion, the room seemed to distort, the walls bending inward. He could feel the pressure, pushing against him from all sides. The darkness started creeping closer. Then the figure's voice, louder this time. "Now you see." And then the room twisted. Everything flipped. The floor, the ceiling, everything around him spun wildly. He gasped for air, but there was none. His vision blurred, and he felt himself falling. But it wasn't a fall. It was a descent into something deeper, darker. His body sank, faster, and the last thing he saw, the eyes of the figure staring into his soul. And then, nothing. The darkness was absolute. There was no light, no sound, just the weight of the void pressing in on all sides. His senses felt stretched thin. His body ached, but he couldn't feel it. It was like he was lost, adrift in a vast, endless ocean, with no shore in sight. It seemed to cut through the stillness, sharp and clear. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight, like something was choking him from the inside. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "You belong here." The words sent a wave of panic through him. He tried to take a step back, but his feet wouldn't move. The darkness tightened around him. The whisper was all around now. It echoed in his mind, filling every corner of his thoughts. You were never meant to leave. And then, the presence. It was there, looming just out of sight, but he could feel it. A pressure, a weight that bore down on him. He strained to see, but the darkness remained impenetrable. The air was thick with it, as if he was suffocating in the very essence of it. And then, a sudden chill, a cold like nothing he had ever known. It was all-encompassing, gripping him to the core. His body shivered violently, but it didn't stop the freezing, spreading deeper inside him. The presence was moving closer. He could feel it. Its eyes, he could feel them on him. The air grew heavier. He gasped, but the breath didn't reach his lungs. It was too late. "Welcome," the voice whispered. And then, the darkness closed in again. The cold was unbearable now. It wasn't just around him. It was inside him. Every inch of his body felt frozen, as if his very soul was being iced over. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every muscle in his body was locked in place. The presence was closer now, so close he could feel it pressing against him, sinking into his skin. The whisper came again, slow and deliberate. You thought you could run. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the suffocating silence. His mouth was dry, his throat tight, like something was tightening its grip on him. "You're already here," the voice crooned, soft as velvet, but full of dark promise. His mind spun. He couldn't think, couldn't make sense of anything. All he could feel was the cold, and the eyes, the feeling that someone, or something, was always watching. The space around him shifted. It wasn't the air anymore. It was the room. It was changing. The darkness twisted, pulled itself tighter, constricting around him. Then a flicker of light, just a spark, a dull, weak light. But it was enough to illuminate something, a shape, a figure. It was there, looming in front of him. The grin, the hollow eyes. The figure stepped forward, its movement fluid, unnatural. It was him, but not him. The twisted version of himself. The version that had haunted him from the very beginning. "You're not going anywhere," the figure hissed, its voice dripping with malice. His chest tightened. The cold was suffocating him now. The air was thick, like the very life was being drained from him. He couldn't escape. He didn't know how. The figure reached out. Its hand, long and bony, hovered just in front of him. The fingers twitched, and the cold intensified, like frost crawling across his skin. He reached out, his hand trembling, but something stopped him. The presence, the suffocating weight of it, held him in place. The figure leaned in closer, its smile stretching wider. "You're already here," it whispered, just inches from his face. And then the darkness swallowed him whole. The darkness was total. There was nothing. No sound, no sensation. Just a heavy, suffocating absence that pressed in on every side. It felt like an eternity, like time had frozen, or perhaps it had never existed at all. His body was numb, no longer his own. He couldn't move. He couldn't feel. And then a crack, a small, faint crack. The silence shattered. It wasn't the light this time. It wasn't the air. It was something else, something deeper. A voice, faint but clear, whispering from the abyss. "You are mine now." The words were not heard. They were felt. A cold, deep sensation that crawled beneath his skin, through his veins, filling his thoughts. The presence in the darkness pressed closer. It was no longer just around him. It was inside him, in his mind, his body, his soul. He tried to fight, tried to resist, but it was useless. The weight of it all was too much. The voice came again, this time louder, closer. "You can never leave." His mind screamed. His heart raced. He fought to break free, but there was no escape. And then the crack deepened. The darkness split open. A sliver of light pierced through, blinding him. It grew, bigger, until the light flooded his vision, washing over him like fire. He tried to look away, but the light was inescapable. And then a figure stepped into the light. It was him, but not him. The twisted reflection, the one with the hollow eyes, the smile that stretched too wide. The figure smiled. "You're home now," it said, its voice like a final breath. And the light consumed him, filling every part of him, until there was nothing left but that dark, endless whisper. "You're next." The light was blinding now, a searing, unyielding force that burned through the darkness. But it wasn't warmth. It was cold, cold as ice, cold as the deepest void. It wrapped around him, consuming him, shoving him into a place where nothing existed but the light, the endless light. And then the whisper returned, deeper now, like it was inside his mind. "You thought you could escape." The voice lingered, its words heavy, weighing down on him like 1,000 tons. His mind reeled. The darkness, the cold, they were everywhere. No matter how much he tried to fight, it was all-consuming. The light flickered, and then the world cracked again. Not like before, but like something shattered, splintered, a break in reality itself. The room was different now. The walls, the floor, the very air, they twisted, warped, became something unrecognizable. He was no longer alone. Figures moved in the corners of his vision, shifting in and out of sight. He couldn't focus. His mind was too clouded, too lost in the labyrinth of darkness and light. And then one of the figures stepped forward. It was the twisted version of himself. But now it was not just a reflection. It was something else. Its face was gaunt, its eyes black pits, its smile a jagged, grotesque thing. "You didn't listen," it said, its voice a raspy, venomous hiss. The air grew colder. The figure's grin grew wider. It reached out, and then it was no longer just a figure. It was a presence, a suffocating, overpowering force that flooded his mind. "You're trapped. You were always trapped," it whispered, and then a final, crushing force. The light faded. The last thing he saw was the figure, its eyes empty, its smile impossibly wide, and then nothing. The nothingness was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light or sound. It was the absence of everything. His body didn't exist. His thoughts didn't exist. There was no air, no time, no sense of reality. Just the oppressive weight of an endless, suffocating void. A sound escaped his lips, and then a cold touch, a whisper of fingers brushing against his skin. He flinched, but there was nowhere to go, no escape. The touch was everywhere now. It covered him, clawed at him from all directions. A low hum began to fill the space, soft at first, but growing louder, more intense. The air shifted. It felt heavy. The pressure, the weight, pushed him deeper, further. He tried to move, to escape the sensation, but it was like he was trapped, locked in place. Then a sound, a voice, so close. It seemed to crawl beneath his skin. "You thought you could leave." The voice was low, calm. It wrapped around him, coiling tighter. He didn't respond, couldn't. His throat was dry, his body paralyzed. The voice came again, this time colder, sharper. "You belong here." The word hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt it in his bones, in the marrow, as though his very being was being pulled into the darkness. He gasped, his heart racing. The pressure was unbearable now. He felt like he was suffocating. And then a flicker, the light. It appeared before him, faint but growing, a tiny point in the center of the blackness. The hum intensified as the light spread, pushing back the dark. He reached for it, his hand trembling. It was the only thing that felt real. But as his fingers drew closer, the light began to fade. Not dimming, but receding. The darkness closed in again, faster, closer. His hand froze, just inches away. Then, the voice, louder now, rising above the hum. "Welcome back." The light blinked out, and the cold returned. The cold was sharper now, gnawing at his bones. His breath came out in shallow gasps, but there was no air. Just a suffocating emptiness, pressing against his chest. He could feel the weight of something ancient, looming just beyond his reach. It was there, right behind him. He didn't need to see it to know. The voice came again, low, threatening. "You never left." His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He tried to turn, but his body wouldn't obey. It felt like he was rooted to the ground, frozen in place. The pressure built around him, wrapping tighter and tighter until he thought he might break. Every breath he tried to take only made it worse. And then a sound, a soft shuffle, coming from the darkness. Slow, measured. He felt something cold brush against his skin. It was like the breath of death itself, icy and unforgiving. The air was thick with it now, suffocating, closing in. The shuffle grew louder, closer. He could feel the presence, creeping along the edges of his mind. And then, a laugh. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more mocking. It came from everywhere. The laugh echoed in the black void. His skin crawled. Did you think you could escape? The words wrapped around him, tighter than the pressure. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He was trapped. The laugh continued, growing more distorted, more twisted, and then a sudden shift. The darkness parted. Not for much, but enough to reveal something. A face. Not a human face, but something else. Something twisted. Its eyes were wide open, empty, voids of black. The mouth twisted into a grin, sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You're mine," it whispered, and in that moment, the last breath left his lungs. The darkness consumed him once more. He was falling again. The sensation was sharp, a plunge into the depths of nothingness. No floor, no walls, just endless, suffocating space. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed up by the void. He tried to fight it, to claw his way back, but his limbs felt heavy, weak. It was as if the darkness was pulling him apart. Then, without warning, the falling stopped. He was standing, but not on solid ground. It felt as if he was floating, suspended in nothing. The air was colder now, and heavier, like it was pressing against him from all sides. Every breath he took felt thick, impossible. A flicker of light, a brief, blinding flash, and then a figure, a shape emerging from the shadows. Tall, thin, its form barely visible, but its eyes, those eyes, they were unmistakable. The same empty black voids, the same cold, hollow stare. The figure took a step forward, one slow, deliberate movement. His heart thudded in his chest, faster, louder. The figure's grin spread wider, a grin full of sharp teeth, impossible to look away from. "You're still here," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural sound. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but his body was frozen, trapped in place. The figure's hand reached out, cold. Pale fingers brushed against his cheek. A shock ran through him, like ice flowing through his veins. The cold was unbearable. It whispered again, this time so close. He could feel its breath on his skin. "You're never leaving." The words settled into his mind, gnawing at his sanity. They echoed, louder with each repetition. He was trapped, forever. The figure leaned in closer, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. And then the world cracked, shattered into pieces. The light blinked out, and he was alone. The silence was deafening. There was no light now, no sound, just the weight of the void. He could feel the emptiness pressing against him, as if the darkness itself had become a living thing. It was everywhere, a thick, smothering presence. His mind raced. He had to move, had to escape, but his limbs were stiff, unresponsive. The air felt dense. It clung to him, gripping his body like invisible chains. And then, a whisper, just a breath of sound. It was behind him, right behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding in his ears. Nothing. The space around him was empty, dark, but the whisper came again, faint at first, then louder, closer. The silence cracked, splintering like glass. A whisper cut through the stillness. low and guttural, but it wasn't clear. It was distant, as if from another realm. "You are returning." The voice was familiar. Familiar and wrong. It seemed to vibrate through him, around him, deep within him. The sensation of feeling slowly returned, but only in fragments, cold, sharp shards of awareness. He could hear his breath now, but it sounded far away, like it came from someone else. The ground shifted beneath him, hard, cold, unforgiving, and then a sliver of light. It pierced the void, weak and flickering, but undeniable. He could feel it drawing him in, like a pull, a magnetic force. With every inch closer, the light grew brighter, warmer. A strange comfort began to seep in, but it was fleeting, fragile. And then he was standing. The room was dim. The walls were closed in around him. But this time, it was different. There were shapes, shadows moving, but not like before. He turned. His legs felt unsteady, but his body was there, solid and real again. In front of him, just within the reach of the dim light, there stood a figure. It was his reflection, but it wasn't. This time, there was no smile, no sharp grin. The eyes were wide, filled with fear. It was a version of him that looked broken, destroyed. He reached out, his hand trembling, but the figure didn't move. Instead, the figure stepped back into the darkness, vanishing just as quickly as it had appeared. The room felt colder now, like something had been left behind, an echo of a presence, still lingering. And then, a door. It appeared suddenly at the far end of the room. The door was open. Beyond it, the hallway stretched out, dark, endless, inviting. He took a step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. Was this it? The escape? But the moment his foot touched the floor, the door slammed shut, and the whisper returned. "You're mine." And everything went black. The blackness was suffocating. It wasn't just empty, it was alive, teeming with a cold presence, a weight that crushed everything around him. His body felt heavy again, like it had become part of the darkness, no longer his own. He tried to move, but his limbs were like stone. His mind screamed for action, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming pressure. The whisper grew louder, closer. "Did you really think you could leave?" It echoed in his mind, twisting, bending the very thoughts he tried to hold on to. He tried to shout, to break free, but the darkness filled his throat, silent and suffocating. Then a flicker of light, so faint, so distant. It was gone before he could focus on it, but it left something, a sense of something real. He pushed against the void, tried to feel his body again, to take control. And then the light flickered again, stronger this time, rushing toward him. It wasn't warmth, but it was something different. It split the darkness, flooding the space around him, the walls, the air. Everything began to shift, bend, twist. The space around him began to reshape, forming a room, but it was wrong. It was his room, but not his room. The bed was there, the walls, the window, but everything felt distorted, like a twisted version of what he knew. And then he saw it, the figure. It was standing in the corner, motionless, the same twisted reflection, with the same black, empty eyes. It wasn't smiling. This time it was still, quiet. But its presence filled the room, like it was the very air itself. "You're here forever," it said, its voice no longer mocking, but dark, resonating through the very bones of the room. The air grew heavier, cold, pressing in on him from every direction. The walls seemed to close in. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was paralyzed. The figure didn't move, but it was all around him now. It was no longer just in front of him. It was inside him, in his mind. And then, the whisper again. You will never leave this place. The light flickered one final time, weak and dying, and in the last moment of clarity, he understood. He was trapped, and there would be no escape. The air was thick. Every breath felt like it was suffocating him. The walls around him pressed in, and the figure, now standing just inches away, loomed over him. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs were like lead. His body was frozen. The figure smiled, its grin wide and unnatural, its black eyes never leaving his face. You thought you could escape, it whispered, its voice a low, rasping growl. The cold had deepened, curling around him like icy fingers. It felt as if his very soul was being drained away, leaving only emptiness. He tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his chest constricted with the weight of the presence. The figure moved closer, its breath foul and cold, and then a sudden, sharp pain. It shot through his chest. He gasped, but the air was gone. The pain pulsed, growing stronger, and then he felt it, his heartbeat, slowly fading. He was sinking, not into the darkness, but into something deeper, something worse. The room around him distorted, spinning, twisting in impossible angles. Everything was shifting, blurring, and then everything stopped. He was alone again. The figure, the room, all gone. But the cold remained. It was inside him now, an eternal chill that no warmth could ever erase. He couldn't feel his body. He couldn't move, but he was still there, trapped in the endless void. He realized then, this wasn't just a place. It was a state he would never leave, a place where time no longer mattered, where nothing changed, where he would never escape. The figure's voice whispered once more, soft, final, "You are mine." And then everything went dark again. The darkness slowly began to fade. But it wasn't the light that emerged. It was silence, a silence so complete. It felt as if the very concept of sound had been erased. His mind, once frantic with fear and confusion, now settled into something else, something darker, something resigned. He couldn't remember how long it had been, but time no longer mattered. He was no longer trapped by it, no longer aware of it. The sensation of his body returned, but it was different, not alive, not fully him. The room was gone. The twisted figure, the suffocating weight of the air, all had dissolved into the void. But there was something new, a faint hum in the distance, a vibration that seemed to pulse through him, calling to him. The stillness began to shudder, ripples moving through the space. The hum grew louder, and then he understood. He had not been abandoned. He had not been left alone. He had become part of it. The hum was a song of the void, a song of the darkness, a song of eternity. The darkness was no longer oppressive. It was familiar. He was no longer a victim of it. He was the void now, the darkness itself. There was no fear, no longing for escape. He was home. The light had never truly been the answer. The door had never been the way out. The figure had never been the enemy. It was the guide, leading him to the place where he belonged. The darkness wasn't something to fight. It was something to embrace. He exhaled for the first time in what felt like an eternity, and as the hum filled the silence, he let go.